Tonight, not too much to say the world watching here as the details of the new CIA torture report unveiled by the Senate this week. This as top UN officials urge that those responsible for the interrogation methods be prosecuted. Our legal panel is here to weigh in. And concerns surrounding race and justice, they're resonating, as you can see, across the country. All eyes now on the next case to get the national attention, that of the Akai Gurley case, now that Garner and Brown decisions have come down. Could claims that the officer who shot Gurley made a call to his union rep before calling for help here present a huge twist in this case. Plus, the mother of the 12-year-old boy in Cleveland who was shot and killed by an officer while holding a toy gun wants the officer tried and convicted. Turns out that the officer has quite a background that could be held against him. We're going to talk about that case and much more this hour. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. We're going to have those cases, plus some questions I've got, even of the lighter variety this week that the panel will help me out on. Well, this week, as we mentioned, a busy week, not just with the unfolding national dialogue we're having on race and justice, but on a bombshell report here released by the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senate Committee, led by Senator Feinstein, that was released. And to say it was disturbing is putting it politely. Tonight, at least 6 U.S. embassies in the Middle East, Asia, and Europe, they're warning of possible anti-American demonstrations. Top UN leaders are also urging that American leaders and CIA officials who authorized the tortured suspects be prosecuted. U.S. officials around the world are on alert, bracing for reaction to this report.
The interrogations of CIA detainees were absolutely brutal, far worse than the CIA represented them to policymakers and others.
The Senate Intelligence Committee's so-called torture report was a 6,700-page damning indictment of the CIA's enhanced interrogation techniques used after September 11th. And the conclusion? The methods were not effective. A British citizen who was held at Guantanamo Bay for 3 years welcomed the U.S. transparency.
But what doesn't happen is accountability.
The abuse began with the CIA's first detainee, al-Qaeda operative Abu Zubaydah, who was waterboarded 83 times. The report says that in one session, Zubaydah became completely unresponsive, with bubbles rising through his open, full mouth. The CIA pushback was quick. Director John Brennan saying the harsh interrogations helped thwart attack plans, capture terrorists, and save lives. But as for the claims that Osama bin Laden was tracked down based on information gleaned from enhanced interrogation, the Senate committee says that's false. President Obama, he told Fusion's Jorge Ramos that there were a lot of people who worked hard to keep the U.S. safe.
But I think that any fair-minded person looking at this would say that some terrible mistakes were made.
There certainly is not consensus on this. 3 former CIA directors wrote in the Wall Street Journal that the Senate report was flat out wrong. They called the report a partisan attack on the agency that's done the most to protect America post 9/11. Terror report, it cites several forms of abuse and torture tactics used by the CIA, and these aren't the garden variety. They consist of rectal feeding, confinement boxes, literally coffin-shaped boxes in size that they were put in. You got waterboarding, and sometimes the numbers staggering here, as well as outright beatings, threats of killing that they'd never make it out alive, stress positions, sleep deprivations. We're talking into the hundreds of hours. All right, let's bring in our legal panel here to discuss this. You got some familiar faces and also a new one for us. Jimmy Kasuris, criminal defense attorney in Manhattan, lecturing at New York Law School and also visiting professor at the University of Birmingham in England. Mark Furnish, professor at Brooklyn Law himself, and also argued before the U.S. Supreme Court. We're going to be talking about some cases before the High Court as well. Mayo Bartlett, attorney, former chief of the Bias Crimes Unit at the Westchester County DA's office, and certainly with a lot of civil rights cases, he's got a lot to say on that, as does Michael Sussman himself, a civil rights attorney, also based in New York in the Hudson Valley. And Mark, when we start this conversation about as it relates with the memo that came out and more also the findings, I should say, from that Senate committee. I'm going to leave the politics out of tonight's conversation. Tomorrow we're going to be joined by experts in the intelligence community, so we'll get into the efficacy of it and even the morality of it. But I want to get into the legality because there's some broader questions that I still think people aren't clear on. And maybe the law is or isn't. Specifically, where does the line start when it relates to torture on international law and what we do, let alone what we can outsource? Is it clear what we can and can't do as a country, whether or not it's a time of war or not?
Well, I don't think it is clear at all, and I think you can come up with a justification for anything. And very, very intelligent lawyers in the Justice Department, John Yoo, who's a professor at UC Berkeley, Bolt Hall, he was the architect of the legal strategy that ostensibly justified the methods that were used. So I don't think primarily that it is a legal question, because arguments can be mustered on either side. Obviously, standard norms of international law are going to be what's governing here. People invoke the Geneva Convention. But we're in an era where the definition of war itself is changing. The proponents of this sort of harsh interrogation will say we're in a perpetual war. You know, who promulgates, who decides whether we're at war? Can there be an executive order? Does there have to be a congressional declaration? I think we're in uncharted territory here. And fundamentally, and I'm sure I'm in the minority here, I don't think this is a legal question. And I would prefer, you used the phrase national discussion in respect to the racist issue before. I would prefer that we weren't discussing this, because by definition, for intelligence to be effective, there has to be a measure of secrecy attending it. And we're not interrogators.
And again, tonight I wasn't going to get into this, but then there is the question about, by law, we have, as everybody knows in a civics lesson, I'm not doing 101 here, we have 3 branches of government. And there's the judicial branch, there's the executive branch, and there's the legislative branch, and there's an advise and consent aspect that Congress says time out. I wasn't told about this. Now, there's disagreement what they were told about, what they weren't told about, what the president and the White House were or were not advised about. Want to get into that, but I get then to the next question, which is, in the war on terror, as Mark said, this undefined war on terror without seemingly an end, do detainees have any rights? And let's make it simple. Let's call them non-American citizens. Do they have any legal rights here? Or if we find a place that we can put them offshore, let's say Gitmo, they're in a whole different other characterization.
I couldn't disagree more with what I just heard. The Supreme Court of the United States has already talked about Gitmo, already extended constitutional protections to people at Gitmo.
Well, they extended the right to bring a habeas corpus petition. They didn't extend constitutional protections.
That's certainly premised on a constitutional protection. If they had no personhood recognized by United States law, they would have no right to pursue habeas corpus. And that's what the Supreme Court said. Beyond that, the United States is a signatory to not only the Geneva Convention, to basic Nuremberg principles, which we were the forefront of. I think this whole argument about the United States, should we prosecute people, should we not prosecute people, is devaluing to our system of law. Of course they should be prosecuted.
Well, we already know, just as a point of fact, the Department of Justice already said they will not pursue prosecutions on this. It's funny, even the ACLU has already said they support the premise of pardoning both the president and anyone involved in the torturing, so they'd be greater daylight.
On the theory that they committed crimes, they should be pardoned. Since you don't pardon someone who hasn't committed a crime.
What crimes did they commit? What crimes would you say that they committed?
They committed basic violations of the laws of war.
Let me explain. What crime in the U.S. Code did they commit?
Well, if we were signatory to the International Criminal Court, then we'd have a problem.
Which we're
and that's
not.
Why, well,
For good
and that's
reason.
a whole other issue. Why is it that if we hold ourselves out as a beacon of justice and transparency, and we're supposed to be the model, that we are not subject to the same laws that everyone else is? So if you're from Haiti, you get dragged out of your country, you're brought to the International Criminal Court. Our government doesn't have those same fears. Although we have people who were involved in this who are afraid to travel to Spain because you may be taken into custody.
Here's
so
the
that
thing
tells
about
us something
the
right there.
I think we're missing a point here. I think we're missing a point. I'm sure the legality and the question of prosecutions is an important one, but I do think that transparency is important here, because while the rules of engagement change often, what happened here puts our military soldiers at risk during the next war. There are rules, whether they're laws or not, there are rules. There are certain things even we in our country acknowledge should not be done. And if we did them, and if we did them at this alarming rate, and if members of the CIA came before Congress and willfully lied to them about it in order to hide it, what happens in the next war?
Well, that's why it's not
to the
partisan issue.
kids that we send there? So that there are rules, they need to be followed,
Jim,
whether or not the breaking of them is prosecutable
On top
or not.
of that, though, how many clients do you have who have done the most minor things, there's no pardon. Okay, so at the end of the day, I have tons of clients who would love to have a pardon so that way you don't have to go to
but
jail.
we're not surprised.
Don't go
by
to
that.
jail,
but
you're just going to
let me
acknowledge
bring
a
this-
crime occurred
But again,
here.
let me bring this full circle, Jimmy, Mark, because unfortunately this is going to happen again. Okay, we don't know where, we don't know what will be the predicate for it, but at the end of the day, something will happen again. I still sit here with 4 smart guys, and nobody can tell me where the line starts and stops. I'm not talking about warfare and rules of engagement. I'm talking about when we, as a country, whether through an intelligence agency or wherever we want to outsource it, do we basically say, do what you're going to do, and if you think it's right, it's okay? Is it as broad as that?
That's what I say, and here's why. Because when you're engaging with enemies who have no respect for norms of international law, and you're unilaterally going to honor norms of international law, you are going to get obliterated. Now, here's the thing. The people in the CIA who failed to protect us allegedly from the 9/11 attacks, they were excoriated in the 9/11 Commission report for their unpreparedness. Now they're being excoriated for their over-preparedness and their prevention.
Time out, though. Wait. I want to get something specific. Okay, wait, time out, though. But wait, what I just want to be clear on, though, is when you read the report, again, I'm getting into where I wasn't hoping to as a policy, but factually, at least, according to the framers of the conclusion of the report, and there's definitely disagreement on the CIA side, they said, you're saying that point A led us to point B, and B was stopping attacks. There's disagreement on that. Leave the facts aside. We outsourced to guys who on their own made up as they went along what they would do to these guys. Not in the aims of national interest. My question is, if they decided to line 12 guys up against the wall and shoot them because they didn't get the intelligence they wanted, under this standard, Mark, we're saying you're still good. Where is the line that you can't go?
It's no different
I don't think there is a line, and here's why I don't think there is a line. And I'm going to be accused of whatever I'm accused of. Here's my line. What's good for the Israelis is good for us, because they're the experts in coping with terror and surviving in the face of terror. I'm sure that overwhelming amounts of mistakes were made. This is going to be a process of trial and error.
Don't we have the American standard, but Mark, isn't our standard American law?
No, because Dianne Feinstein in Washington and a bunch of bureaucrats in a plush office.
By the way, John McCain, too.
I understand McCain's perspective, and he, of course, has far more credibility on this. A bunch of bureaucrats sitting in a Washington office are going to pretend to be on the front lines of the war on terror and say what can and can't be done.
All right. I'll let you have a word on this, Mike, but we're on time thing. But I do want you, if you can put it in context, as a history thing here, we're going all over the place, but I do think it's we had the Church Commission. Well, we learned in the Church Commission, okay, if you go back more than 40 years ago, don't break the mic, that says the CIA, we needed to rein in at different points in American history because they were making up their own rules. And this was on domestic American soil.
Domestically, it's different.
Okay, wait.
Spying on John Lennon is different.
But you know, it's
These
the same
people
thing
are
that-
not pussycats.
So,
that
Michael,
they're
I'll give you the last
interrogating.
word on this one because his argument is, hey, you know what? These guys, they're beheading people. Why are we playing by a different set of rules, holding ourselves to standards that imperil American security?
Because we want a pedestal by which to criticize their beheading people. And under his frame of reference in the world he's creating, there is no such American pedestal. There's no Western values. There's nothing.
Here's the thing.
Excuse me. I didn't
Whether we adhere to Western values or not, we're going to get ripped because now we're getting blasted for having disclosed the report.
You are interrupting, which is unfortunate. It's not the way lawyers behave. The basic problem that we have here is very simple. There is a rule of law. There are clear international norms. They were set by the United States, and they have been set since the 19-teens. We've had a 100-year struggle to establish the laws of war. Those laws pertain to everyone.
They pertain to every.
That's going to be at the final point here.
Established as
That
we
is established.
I got to go to gavel. All right, when we come back here, we'll switch gears. We're going to do this all night here, but I do want to look at the issue that's dominated headlines for the last at least few weeks, if not months, in this country, and that is race injustice. Attention now turning from Missouri to Staten Island to now Brooklyn, the case of Akai Gurley. Should the case even go to a grand jury? Did the officer accused of pulling that fatal trigger here not only abandon police protocol, but could the order of the phone calls made actually be a tipping point in this case? We'll get into all that after this.